What happens when a house becomes more than shelter? When walls built to keep weather out and family in seem to hold something older than memory and stranger than fear? Across different decades and countries, people have stepped across ordinary thresholds and found themselves facing events that seemed to resist every language they had for truth. Not legend, not rumor, but lived experience, recorded in reports, repeated in interviews, carried for years in the bodies of those who were there. There is something uniquely unsettling about a home disturbed from within. We expect danger to come from storms, from strangers, from the visible world. But these stories begin in kitchens, hallways, bedrooms, staircases, in places lit by porch lamps and morning sun, a rental house in Indiana, a brick home in North London, a farmhouse in Rhode Island, an apartment in Madrid, places so ordinary they might have belonged to anyone. And perhaps that is why they endure. The people at the center of these accounts were not searching for mystery. Most were families already carrying the quiet burdens of life, children to raise, bills to pay, grief to survive, a new beginning to attempt. Then came the first detail that did not fit, a sound with no source, an object where it did not belong, a voice from an empty room. Small things at first, the kind the mind tries to forgive. But some disturbances do not fade when ignored. They streaming interrupted, waiting for the complete message. What if the first sign was not a scream in the night, but something quieter? A sound so small it could be mistaken for the house settling into itself. In Gary, Indiana, a modest rented home once stood like thousands of others on its block, plain and functional, a place meant for rebuilding a life. For the family who moved in, it offered what many homes offer at first: shelter, routine, the fragile promise of stability. There were children's voices in the rooms, meals shared at a table, the ordinary choreography of domestic life. Nothing in its appearance suggested that it would soon become one of the most discussed houses in modern American paranormal history. The early disturbances arrived almost politely. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening when no one had touched them, a sense, difficult to name, that the air itself had changed. The family tried the explanations most of us would try first. Old plumbing, drafts, stress, misunderstanding. Houses make noise, children imagine things. Adults under pressure can begin to connect patterns that are not there. Reason offered comfort, at least for a while, but some experiences did not stay small. One by one, the stories grew stranger, and what had seemed like isolated incidents began to form a pattern that frightened everyone inside the home. A child speaking in a different voice, sudden trances, movements that felt impossible to witness and harder still to repeat without embarrassment. Soon, concerns spilled beyond the family itself. Neighbors talked, church officials listened, medical staff observed, police were called, and the most unsettling detail was not that people believed something unusual might be happening. It was that even skeptical witnesses struggled to dismiss what they thought they had seen. In every age, there are moments when a private fear becomes a public question. This house became one of those moments. And before anyone reached for the language of possession or haunting, there was a more intimate truth beneath it all. A family, already vulnerable, trying to decide whether they were confronting the supernatural, the psychological, or some painful intersection of both. When a home stops feeling like refuge, what remains for the people inside it? How does doubt survive when it is forced to stand in the same room as fear? As reports from the Indiana house spread, the story shifted from family testimony to something more complicated. Social workers documented behavior they found difficult to categorize. Nurses and physicians saw children in states that seemed to move beyond ordinary distress. A police captain spoke of incidents that unsettled even trained observers. Each new account widened the circle, drawing in people whose professions were built on procedure, documentation, and evidence. And still, the center of the story remained painfully human. A mother trying to protect her children while the world around her struggled to name what they were living through. This is where such stories become most revealing. Not when they offer answers, but when they expose the limits of our preferred ones. Science asks for patterns, causes, repeatable outcomes. Faith asks different questions about meaning, suffering, and forces unseen. Between those worlds stands the witness, often tired, frightened, and uncertain, trying to describe an event that seems to belong fully to neither language. The Indiana case drew that tension into the open. Some saw trauma expressing itself through the body. Others saw a spiritual crisis no medical chart could hold. Many saw a family under enormous pressure interpreted through the filters of culture, belief, and fear. And yet, dismissal can be its own kind of blindness. It is easy from a distance to reduce extraordinary claims into categories that make us feel safe: hoax, illness, suggestion, folklore. Sometimes those categories are correct. Sometimes they are incomplete. What made this house endure in the public imagination was not simply the intensity of the claims, but the discomforting possibility that multiple truths might have existed at once. That suffering could be real, even if interpretation remained uncertain. That a family could be both witnessed and misunderstood. In that sense, the house became more than a place of alleged phenomena. It became a mirror. It asked how modern people respond when reality stops fitting neatly into the containers we have built for it. And perhaps the deeper mystery was never just what was in the house, but why uncertainty itself can feel so haunting when children are involved and no explanation arrives in time. It started, as so many haunting stories do, with a house that looked almost too ordinary to remember. In North London, on a quiet street lined with brick and routine, a family settled into a modest home and tried to build a life within it. There were school mornings, laundry, arguments, laughter, the soft repetitions that make up domestic time. If mystery was present at first, it hid itself well. It arrived not as spectacle, but as interruption, a knocking sound from inside the walls, furniture shifting slightly out of place, a chair that seemed to move with a will of its own. At first, the family did what families do. They checked pipes, they blamed drafts, they questioned the children, then themselves. But the disturbances gathered texture. Loud bangs echoed through rooms with no visible cause. Objects slid, toppled, or flew. Voices emerged in moments that felt both theatrical and deeply wrong, as if the house had found a way to speak through the youngest among them. Soon the home was no longer a private world. Reporters came, investigators came, neighbors listened from the pavement. Cameras and notebooks entered rooms where bedtime and breakfast had once been the only matters that counted. This is the strange transformation these cases often undergo. A family's confusion becomes public material. Intimate fear turns into evidence, entertainment, argument. Every witness brings not only attention, but interpretation. Some saw an elaborate performance shaped by loneliness, stress, and suggestion. Others believed they were watching a genuine eruption of forces science could not comfortably map. The house became a stage on which belief and skepticism performed side by side. And yet, beneath the headlines and recordings, something quieter remained. A family was living through nights they could not predict, in rooms they could not fully trust. Whether the movements came from spirits, psychology, or some uneasy blend of both, the emotional truth was unmistakable. A home had become unstable in the deepest sense. And once the familiar begins to move on its own, the question is no longer simply what is happening. It is whether the idea of safety was ever as solid as we imagined. What do we really see when a room begins to move? An external force or the invisible strain already living inside the people who inhabit it? The North London case lingered because it seemed to offer too much and too little at once. There were photographs of children lifted in midair, audio recordings of harsh, unfamiliar voices, witnesses who insisted the furniture moved without human hands. For some, these fragments felt like rare proof that the unseen had briefly stepped into view. For others, they suggested something more earthly: mischief, performance, a household under pressure responding to grief and attention in ways no one fully understood. The truth may have been less satisfying than either side hoped. The family at the center of the disturbances had already known disruption before the knocking began. Separation, financial strain, the loneliness that can settle over a home after loss, these were not supernatural forces, but they were powerful ones. A house does not need ghosts to feel burdened. Children, especially, often become the instruments through which a family's unspoken tension finds expression. And yet, even that explanation leaves behind details that remain stubborn, awkward, unresolved. Not every witness was naive. Not every event was easy to stage. The uncertainty itself became the story's most durable feature. This is why certain haunted houses survive in memory while others fade. They do not merely frighten us. They disturb the boundaries we depend on. They challenge the line between deception and belief, between emotional truth and factual certainty. They ask whether human beings can generate mysteries powerful enough to feel supernatural, or whether the world still contains corners that refuse to be reduced. Long after reporters left and the house returned to silence, the larger question remained. Perhaps haunting is not always about the dead intruding on the living. Perhaps it is also about unresolved pain finding shape in sound, motion, and story. A home can hold grief the way wood holds cold, and sometimes what terrifies us most is not the possibility that something else is present, but the realization that ordinary life itself may be deeper, stranger, and less explainable than we are prepared to admit. What if the most unsettling houses are not the ones that seem hostile, but the ones that seem to remember? In the countryside of Rhode Island, there stood an old farmhouse weathered by seasons, its wood darkened by rain, its rooms layered with the slow accumulation of generations. Such places carry a particular kind of silence. Floors bend slightly under time. Doors breathe with the cold. Every beam seems to hold the imprint of hands long gone. To step inside is to feel history not as an idea, but as a physical presence pressing gently from every wow. For one family, that presence soon felt less gentle. They had come to the farmhouse hoping for space, renewal, perhaps even a more grounded life. Instead, the home seemed to greet them with disturbances that grew steadily more intimate. There were sounds in the night, doors that opened on their own, shadows glimpsed at the edge of sight. Then came something harder to dismiss, a repeated sense that the house was observing them, not in the theatrical manner of legend, but with the slow patience of a place unwilling to surrender its past. What made this story endure was not just the suggestion of ghosts, but the emotional terrain around it. The family was large, loving, imperfect, already carrying the ordinary fatigue of work, marriage, and child-rearing. As tension in the home deepened, the reported phenomena seemed to gather around its most vulnerable fault lines. Fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, a whisper here, a bruise of dread there, until the farmhouse no longer felt like a structure they inhabited, but a history they had entered without permission. Old houses often awaken something in us that has little to do with spirits and everything to do with time. They remind us that others have stood where we stand, suffered where we sleep, vanished while the walls remained. Perhaps that is why they can feel haunted even before anything unusual occurs. The Rhode Island farmhouse would become known for darker claims in the years ahead. But beneath them all was a quieter question. When we inherit a place, do we ever truly inherit only its rooms, or do we also take possession of the unfinished human stories it could never forget? It began, as these stories often do, with the smallest break in routine. A door found open, a voice heard where no one stood, a presence sensed just beyond the edge of certainty. As the family settled deeper into the Rhode Island farmhouse, the disturbances seemed to take on intention. What had first felt like the natural unease of an old house began to feel directed, almost personal. Some family members described being touched in empty rooms. Others spoke of waking in terror, convinced that someone or something was standing beside the bed. The house was no longer merely creaking with age. It seemed to answer back. And yet, what makes this case so compelling is not simply the severity of the claims. It is the way the house became a vessel for multiple forms of fear at once. There was the fear of the unseen, certainly. But there was also the strain of isolation, the exhaustion of parenting, the deepening pressure that comes when sleep is broken night after night and certainty begins to erode. A haunting in this sense does not only invade a home, it invades interpretation. It changes how every sound is heard, how every shadow is read. When outside investigators eventually entered the farmhouse, they brought with them cameras, questions, and the promise of meaning. Their presence transformed private distress into a larger narrative, one the public could absorb through the familiar language of curses, spirits, and unfinished death. Such frameworks can be comforting. They give shape to chaos, but they can also simplify something more complex, the intimate and destabilizing experience of living in a place that seems to amplify whatever pain already exists within it. Perhaps that is why the farmhouse still lingers in the imagination. It was not just described as haunted. It felt emotionally inhabited by everything human beings try and fail to leave behind: grief, memory, violence, longing. Whether those forces took supernatural form or remained expressions of history pressing on the present, the effect was the same. The family found themselves living in a question older than reason itself. Can a place absorb enough suffering that it begins, in some mysterious way, to speak it back to the living? What if the real power of a haunted house lies not in what it proves, but in what it awakens inside everyone who hears about it? By the time the Rhode Island farmhouse entered popular imagination, it had become more than a family's ordeal. It had turned into a symbol, one of those rare places where folklore, testimony, and modern media merged into a single enduring myth. The house was no longer only a structure of timber and stone. It became a stage for the ancient human drama between skepticism and belief, where every retelling added a new layer and every listener supplied a different ending. That transformation tells us something important about why certain stories survive. We do not return to these houses merely for fear. We return because they offer a language for experiences that ordinary life often leaves unnamed. Homes are where we love, argue, age, and mourn. They witness our private selves more intimately than any church or courtroom ever could. So when something uncanny is said to happen there, it feels less like an invasion of a building and more like a disturbance of the human soul. The haunted house becomes a metaphor for memory itself: rooms we keep revisiting, sounds we cannot quite place, doors inside us that never fully close. In that sense, the farmhouse belonged as much to the living as to the dead. It held a family's exhaustion, their tenderness, their fear of losing control over the one place meant to protect them. It also held the public's hunger for meaning, for evidence that life might extend beyond what can be measured, or that pain might leave an imprint strong enough to outlast the body. Whether one sees the story as supernatural, psychological, or cultural, it remains powerful because it touches a permanent uncertainty in us. And maybe that is the deeper truth behind such places. Not that every wall contains a spirit, but that every home stores the invisible residue of human life. Love leaves traces. So does grief. So does terror. The question is not only whether houses can be haunted, it is whether we, carrying our own unfinished histories, ever truly enter a room alone. What if the strangest disturbances are the ones that happen in broad daylight, in a home filled not with Gothic shadows, but with the familiar clutter of modern life? In a district of Madrid, inside an ordinary apartment where sunlight crossed tiled floors and city noise drifted in from the street, a family began to notice something unsettling. It was not the age of the building that troubled them. It was the sense that the impossible had chosen a place too contemporary, too lived in, too rational to accommodate it. The home had the texture of everyday life: cups in the sink, school books on a table, the murmur of television in the evening. And still, in the middle of that recognizable world, there came reports of sounds, sudden movements, and a presence the family could neither welcome nor ignore. Then came the face. Accounts from the apartment would later describe an image forming on the floor, as though the material surface itself had begun to reveal a human expression. Some saw a trick of moisture, chemistry, or pattern recognition. Others saw something more unnerving, a likeness emerging where no likeness should be, changing over time, resisting simple removal. The story spread because it seemed to invert our assumptions about haunting. This was not a figure glimpsed in a hallway and then lost to darkness. It was an image said to remain, almost like a message left behind by forces no one could confidently name. As investigators, neighbors, and the curious began to gather around the case, the apartment shifted from private dwelling to public riddle. The family at its center had to live with both the phenomenon and the attention it attracted. That may be one of the crueler features of such stories. A home already made unstable by uncertainty becomes even harder to inhabit once the outside world begins looking in. And so the Madrid apartment entered the long archive of places that trouble the boundary between matter and meaning. Was it a natural process mistaken for revelation, a projection of collective expectation, or something still more elusive, where environment, belief, in history briefly converged. Sometimes the mystery is not that an image appears. It is that once we have seen a face in the ordinary world, we are never entirely sure whether it was the wall speaking or our own need for the world to answer back. How do we decide what is real when reality seems to leave a mark that can be photographed, measured, and still not understood? The Madrid apartment became unforgettable not because it offered certainty, but because it seemed to invite examination and survive it. People did not rely only on whispered testimony. Samples were discussed. Observers came and went. Explanations were proposed with the confidence of science and the caution of doubt. Mineral reactions, stains, humidity, suggestion, deliberate manipulation. Each theory carried a piece of plausibility, and yet none managed to quiet the fascination entirely. The image, or what people believed they saw in it, had already crossed into that charged territory where evidence and interpretation no longer travel together. This is the paradox at the center of so many unexplained houses. The more visible the phenomenon becomes, the less stable its meaning may be. A shadow in a corridor can be forgotten. A sound in the night can be rationalized. But a face-like form emerging from the surface of a home touches something older in the human imagination. Since ancient times, we have searched stone, clouds, water, and flame for signs of ourselves. We are meaning-making creatures. We detect patterns not only because the mind is vulnerable to illusion, but because pattern has always been one of the ways we survive. To see a face where none should exist is both a cognitive habit and an emotional event. And perhaps that is why the Madrid case continues to resonate. It lives at the meeting point of chemistry and myth, perception and longing. It asks whether mystery loses its power when examined, or whether close scrutiny only reveals how fragile our categories can be. We like to imagine that modern life has cleared away the old enchantments, that tiled apartments and electric lights have protected us from the strange. But every so often, a simple domestic surface unsettles that confidence. In the end, the apartment offered no final verdict, only a deeper kind of unease. Not the fear that a ghost had been proven, but the quieter recognition that the world may still produce images, events, and experiences that exceed our neat explanations. And when that happens, we are left facing the oldest question of all. Do we fear the unknown because it is out there, or because it reveals how little of ourselves we truly understand? What if the most enduring mysteries are not the loudest, but the ones that settle slowly into history, refusing either to disappear or to fully declare themselves? Across continents and decades, these houses begin to speak to one another. A rented home in the American Midwest, a North London row house, a weathered farmhouse in New England, a city apartment in Spain. Different architectures, different cultures, different families. And yet each story bends toward the same uneasy center. Ordinary people living in places where the boundary between material fact and human perception seems to thin. What joins them is not proof but pattern. Again and again, the disturbances begin in domestic time, during dinner, before school, in the middle of the night when someone rises for a glass of water. The supernatural, if that is what it is, does not appear in grand ceremonial spaces. It appears beside cribs, in hallways, near kitchen tables. That detail matters. It suggests that our deepest fear is not of the unknown in distant forests or abandoned ruins. It is of the unknown entering the very places we build to keep life coherent. And still another pattern emerges alongside fear. Witness. Parents compare notes. Children speak in fragments. Clergy arrive with ritual. Investigators arrive with cameras and skepticism. Doctors and police sometimes stand in the same rooms as believers and come away with different conclusions. In every case, the house becomes more than a location. It becomes a testing ground for the ways human beings decide what counts as real. Perhaps that is why these stories endure, even when answers do not. They are not simply about apparitions, moving objects, or voices in the dark. They are about the fragile systems by which we make sense of experience. Science gives us method. Faith gives us meaning. Story gives us memory. But certain events seem to hover between all three, unwilling to settle. So these homes remain with us, not as solved puzzles, but as inhabited questions. They remind us that mystery does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it enters quietly, rearranges the ordinary, and leaves us staring at the familiar as if seeing it for the first time. And once that happens, can a place ever become entirely ordinary again? What happens to a family after the cameras leave, after the investigators pack their equipment, after the last headline fades into the archive? This is the part such stories often neglect. We remember the phenomena, the recorded voices, the moving furniture, the face in the floor. We remember the house as symbol, but the people inside those homes are not symbols. They are left to carry something far less dramatic and far more lasting: the memory of uncertainty. Whether they believe they encountered spirits, trauma, misinterpretation, or some mixture no vocabulary can fully contain, they must go on living in the aftermath of an event that changed their relationship to reality. And that aftermath can be its own kind of haunting. A person who has once doubted the evidence of their own senses rarely returns unchanged. Every future creak in a staircase, every unexplained draft, every silence in a room can feel newly charged. Even leaving the house does not always end the experience. Some families move, but the story moves with them. It follows into conversations, into sleep, into the hesitant way memory is retold at family gatherings years later. The house may be behind them, yet part of its atmosphere remains inside. This is where the meaning of these stories becomes more profound than the question of literal proof. A haunting, real or perceived, reveals how vulnerable human beings are to places. We do not merely occupy homes, we bond with them. We project safety into them. We entrust them with childhood, illness, intimacy, mourning. So when a home becomes unstable, something foundational in us loosens as well. The disturbance is architectural, but also emotional, almost existential. Maybe that is why these accounts continue to resonate long after their details are disputed. They touch a truth broader than the paranormal. They remind us that certainty is not the natural state we imagine it to be. We live by trust. Trust in walls, in memory, in the continuity of the everyday. When that trust fractures, even briefly, the effect can outlast any visible event. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of every haunted house. Not that it proves another world, but that it changes forever the one its witnesses thought they knew. What if the deepest reason we tell these stories is not to explain the unknown, but to find language for the parts of life that have always exceeded explanation? By now, the houses form a kind of quiet constellation. Each one glows with its own atmosphere, one charged by fear, another by grief, another by public scrutiny, another by the stubborn materiality of a mark left behind. Yet together they reveal something larger than any single haunting. They show us how human beings stand at the threshold between evidence and meaning, always trying to turn unsettling experience into a narrative we can survive. That effort is as old as civilization. Long before modern investigations, people gave names to the forces that seemed to move through homes and landscapes: ancestors, spirits, omens, curses. Not always because they were naive, but because they understood something modern language often forgets. Mystery is not only an intellectual problem, it is an emotional condition. When something extraordinary enters ordinary life, the first need is not always explanation. Sometimes it is containment. A story can hold what the mind cannot yet solve. And so, whether these houses were shaped by supernatural presence, psychological strain, environmental anomalies, or the immense suggestive power of fear, they all reveal the same human instinct. We gather around the uncertain. We compare testimony. We argue. We interpret. We return to the details again and again, not only to ask what happened, but to ask what kind of world allows such things to be felt so deeply. Perhaps that is why skepticism and wonder are not true enemies. Both are responses to mystery. One asks for discipline. The other asks for openness. Together, at their best, they keep us honest before the unknown. They remind us not to surrender too quickly either to fantasy or to dismissal. In the end, the houses remain unsolved in the most meaningful sense. Not because no theory exists, but because each case leaves behind a remainder, something emotional, symbolic, or experiential that does not vanish under analysis. And maybe that remainder is the point. For all our instruments and theories, we are still creatures listening in the dark, trying to decide whether the sound we heard came from the walls, from history, or from the hidden chambers of our own remembering. In the end, perhaps the question was never simply whether these houses were haunted. The more enduring question is why such places continue to matter, even now in an age that prides itself on measurement, data, and proof. Why do stories of disturbed rooms, unseen presences, and impossible moments still reach something tender and unsettled in us? Maybe because they speak to a truth older than belief itself. Human life is lived on the edge of mystery, whether we acknowledge it or not. A house is never just wood, plaster, brick, or stone. It is where we keep the shape of our days. It holds our private rituals, our arguments, our illnesses, our laughter, our dead. Over time, a home becomes more than structure. It becomes a container for memory. And memory is never as stable as we want it to be. It shifts. It lingers. It returns in fragments. In that sense, every house is already a kind of archive filled with traces of things no longer visible but not entirely gone. That may be why stories like these endure across generations, not because they offer final answers, but because they honor a permanent human condition. We are always trying to understand more than we can fully know. We build explanations. We test them. We tell stories where explanations fail. Somewhere between those efforts lives the quiet dignity of our curiosity, the refusal to stop asking, the willingness to sit for a moment with uncertainty and let it reveal something about us. Whether the forces in these homes were supernatural, psychological, environmental, or woven from several truths at once, the emotional reality remains. People were frightened, families were changed, witnesses were left searching for language, and we, listening from a distance, are left with our own reflection in the glass. We want certainty, yet we are drawn to the unresolved. We long for the world to be explainable, yet some part of us still listens for what lies just beyond explanation. So the doors close, the lights dim, and the houses fall quiet again. But the questions remain, patient as ever. What stays in a place after people leave? What stays in us after an experience we cannot name? And how much of the future will always be shaped by the mysteries we carry forward, not as proof of darkness, but as evidence of how deeply and how humbly human beings continue to wonder.